Thanks very much, Ken, for a very generous introduction, and thank you for coming out to hear what's bound to be a depressing talk, I guess. But I'm very glad to be here. It's been exciting, if sort of staggering, to look at the hurricane damage. Okay, I'm going to talk about introduced species. I'm not going to talk much about what they do, because I assume that you know something about some of the things they do. By the way, if you're interested, this catfish, this is introduced, and this was in South Georgia. So keep your eyes open. It's known to be breeding there. Anyway, the scope of the threats posed by introduced species actually was first pretty broadly depicted by a famous ecologist, Charles Elton, who published this little book. It's a popular book based on a radio series in 1958. But it didn't attract a huge amount of attention then, except maybe among some academic ecologists. But they began to get, introduced species began to get much more attention in the 1980s as problem after problem after problem, environmental problems, could be traced to introduced species. And so by 1992, it was one of the major planks in the Biological Diversity Convention at Rio. And now, of course, introduced species are pretty widely recognized, one of the major global changes occurring. And in fact, they currently and for the next few decades cause more damage, both ecologically and economically, than global warming, for example, which gets a lot more press. But everyone knows they're a big problem. In the US, we have President Clinton's Executive Order 13112, which says we have a problem, and we have to figure out how to deal with it. And in response to the executive order, which was 1999, 2 years later, the federal government produced a management plan for federal activities to deal with introduced species. And there are lots of popular books now on introduced species. And every couple days, there's another horror story in the newspapers. So I'm sure some of you have read about snakeheads. That got a lot of press because it was near Washington, D.C., and they're now established there, and probably in Pennsylvania also. And you have Formosan termites, and Asian swamp eels, and citrus canker, sort of the invader of the week. And here, of course, you have Chinese tallow, and you have Kogan grass, and you've read lots about them, and there are many others. Madagascan hissing cockroaches are now on the loose in several places. People were selling them in pet stores, and some of them got out. They're big. They're about this big. Okay, well, I'm not going to summarize what they do, that is the real threats. That would be another talk. Suffice it to say that for conservationists, the big impact is that they're the second leading cause of endangerment and extinction of species. Fully half of the species on the federal endangered species list are threatened wholly or in part by introduced species, and it's a much bigger problem in that regard than pollution or overharvest or disease, or second only to habitat destruction. And in terms of economic damage, there's a recent first ballpark estimate for the US that they cost the economy somewhere around $130 to $140 billion a year in various ways. And here's one of them that I'm sure you know about. And what's striking to me is that just as the public and policymakers and managers and scientists are beginning to grasp the overall magnitude of this issue, an air of pessimism has settled. It often pervades discussions of what to do about introduced species. And many people say that, well, yeah, it's bad and it's happening. We can't do anything about it, so we shouldn't try to waste money doing it. It's captured very nicely by this, in this magazine article not too long ago by David Quammen, the Nature writer, who is a friend of mine. And David entitled his article Planet of Weeds. He's writing a book about it. And the article suggested that if we look ahead 2 centuries, say, the Earth will still be green, and there'll be lots of plants in every place. But they'll all be the same plants. They'll be the weeds. And they'll be the same plants in Pensacola, and the same plants in Los Angeles, and the same plants in Thailand, et cetera, and that there's not much we can do about it. That was the thrust of his article. And there's certainly no doubt that the problem is getting worse. These are some data that some colleagues of mine and I put together for a project showing 4 different, the growth in the number of introduced species in 4 different groups. As you can see here, these are terrestrial vertebrates, mollusks, plant pathogens, and insects. So the problem is definitely getting worse. Nowadays, there are probably around 8,000 or so introduced species in the United States, compared to about 200,000 native species. But many of them are very, very common. Some are our most common species. So it's getting worse. But the general theme of my talk tonight is that there really is a lot we can do about this, and that the impediments are largely political and sociological rather than technological. And if we really wanted to control this problem, we could. There are basically 3 stages at which we could deal with it. We could keep them out in the first place. If they get in, we could try to eradicate them, which is easier if we detect them very quickly. And if we fail to do that, even once they establish, there are various ways to manage many of them at densities that are very low. I won't talk too much about the first point, because that really is almost wholly a political issue rather than a scientific one. I'll talk much more about these two, but I'll begin by talking about keeping them out, okay? Well, the main entity in the US that keeps them out is Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, which is part of the USDA, but part of it has been moved to the Department of Homeland Security. And everyone complains about APHIS, that it doesn't do a good job. It's woefully underfunded. It has staff that's not nearly commensurate with the problem. And all those things are true, except the first. It actually does do a pretty good job given the resources it has. And we know for a fact that it's kept out hundreds and hundreds of species that would very likely have been quite harmful. We know that because they keep lists of intercepted species, and I've seen those, and there are hundreds and hundreds of very bad actors on them. And furthermore, they could do a much better job. And it's not, the better funding would help, but that's not the main problem. The main problem is the regulations. And the main culprit here is really the multinational treaties, like WTO especially. The WTO treaties are a huge problem. In the past, in the era of bilateral treaties governing trade between nations, any nation like the United States could simply refuse to accept a species as a trade good or a product that might carry an introduced species, or a disease, which would also be an introduced species. And that would be the end of it. But that's not how it works nowadays. All the signatory nations have basically signed away their own rights to decide for themselves what's too dangerous. And any exclusion of a product on environmental grounds, like a decision not to allow in untreated wooden packing because it might carry some horrible pest, can be appealed on the grounds that this is just a covert form of protectionism. And the appeal is heard not by the excluding country, but by the adjudicating body of the treaty organization, like the WTO or NAFTA. Furthermore, in all of the multilateral trade treaties, any claimed exclusion on environmental grounds has to be accompanied by a risk assessment that quantifies the risk. And these are, this is an example of one of several that have been done in the US. Here the point was that large trees from the Soviet Far East could carry insects or plant pathogens that would then harm our forests. And so that's what this risk assessment was about. But there's a big problem here, and the problem is that risk assessments for living species are in a very primitive state right now. It's not like risk assessments for chemicals for a whole bunch of technical reasons, and everyone recognizes this. So it's almost impossible to produce a quantitative, a really good quantitative risk assessment. Well, in an era in which free trade is sort of a religion, it's not surprising that the multilaterals like WTO have been relentlessly hostile to claimed exemptions based on environmental grounds. The latest case is really very instructive, and that has to do with Australia and Canada. Canada wanted to ship frozen trout to Australia, and Australia refused to accept them on the grounds that they might carry parasites that would then infect native Australian fish, a number of which are endangered. And the Australians weren't just whistling Dixie about this. I'm sure many of you have heard of whirling disease of trout in the US. Have people heard of this? This is a horrible case. This is a European and Asian pathogen that was brought to Pennsylvania in frozen trout from Sweden, and then sold in supermarkets in one area of Pennsylvania. And people cooked them on barbecues, and some of them were near a stream, and the remains got into the stream, and the stream happened to drain into the largest trout hatchery in the US. And they were shipped out west, and now there are no rainbow trout fisheries in Montana and large parts of Idaho and Colorado. It's an enormous environmental and economic loss. So this is not a capricious thought on the part of the Australians. However, Canada appealed to the WTO, which sustained the appeal on the grounds that primarily on the grounds that the Australians could not produce a quantitative risk assessment saying what the exact probability was that this event would happen. Now, of course, the U.S. is the 800-pound gorilla in the WTO could probably, well, I guess nowadays it's more like the 400-pound gorilla, and the EU is the other 400 pounds. But certainly, the U.S. could do something about this, but it's not a high priority item right now to regulate trade. Okay, if we fail to keep them out, let's just picture whirling disease. And what happens. If we fail to keep them out, the next step is to try to eradicate them, okay? Especially if we find them early. And eradicating a species it has a bad name in both the scientific and the popular literatures because of some very high-profile early failures in eradication. A classic one that will resonate with you is our beloved introduced fire ant, which came into through Mobile, of course, and has spread and spread. It's now reached Tennessee. It arrived in Knoxville the same week that I did, by the way. It's true. But actually, beginning in 1957, the USDA conducted for 14 years an elaborate, very expensive eradication campaign using chlorinated hydrocarbons. They said, we're going to eradicate the fire ant, and it was an utter fiasco. Ed Wilson calls this the Vietnam of entomology. What happened was that the fire ant did very well, and it killed many competing ants, and it also, some of these chlorinated hydrocarbons had other impacts on vertebrates, including potentially humans, and so it was just a waste of money. And this is a pretty well-known story, and there's some other high-profile affairs, but there are actually many successes. Like rats have been eradicated from a number of islands, bigger and bigger ones. The biggest one now is about 30,000 acres. And even introduced plants have been eradicated, again, usually from fairly small islands. Like sandbur was eradicated over about, well, it's almost eradicated. There was one individual last year, over 12 years now, on the island of Laysan in the Hawaiian chain. It covered about 30% of the vegetated part of the island, and It's now all gone except for one individual sprouted last year. This is by hand pulling and using glyphosate herbicides. And there are other eradication campaigns, very large islands that were successful, like the yellow fever mosquito, Aedes aegypti, was eradicated from Cuba, actually. And more recently, the melon fly, which is a relative of the medfly, and it's a horrible pest of fruits and vegetables, was eradicated from the entire Ryukyu archipelago of Japan, including Okinawa and Amami Oshima, completely eradicated. And it's not only from islands. This is an African mosquito, Anopheles gambii, which carries malaria, and was eradicated from an area of around 100,000 square miles of northeastern Brazil over a 2-year period. And here's another interesting case. This is a Eurasian weed, Cochia scoparia, that got into Western Australia. It was deliberately introduced, even though it was listed as a federal noxious weed in the US at this time. They were always looking for better pasture plants. And by the time they realized it was a problem, it had spread to, it's about 8,000 acres spread out over roughly 600 miles and really scattered. And the Australians, the Western Australian government mounted an eradication campaign that ultimately succeeded, eliminating every last one. And it's now been, it's gone from Australia for 4 years. It's never returned. It wasn't even that expensive. It cost them about $250,000 US. Well, if you look at successes and failures of eradication campaigns, to my mind, there are 3 key features that typify the successes, and the failures always seem to lack one or more of these. First, there have to be adequate resources to do the job identified at the outset. What has often happened, a good example would be the gypsy moth, for example, a very good example, is that an eradication campaign would begin. It would make great progress. Whatever the target pest was would be reduced to the point where it wasn't much of a problem. People didn't see it, and then the funding agency would cut the funding because it wasn't a problem. And so then the population increases again, and ultimately the pest gets out of control. So there have to be adequate resources. Secondly, eradication by its nature is an all or none proposition. You can't have everybody in the county, every property owner, going along with the plan except for 2 people who don't want to do it. Or you can't have every state agreeing to try to eradicate the fire ant except for one that says it's not going to be part of it. So at every level, there's this problem of having to have some individual or entity that really can compel cooperation. And this sounds trivial, but in places like Florida, where there's not much law, sometimes you can have individuals, just deciding they're not going to cooperate with the eradication campaign. And I could cite several examples where eradications have failed because there simply wasn't adequate authority to compel cooperation. And the third point is that you can't just go out and dump DDT on the species or Roundup or whatever it is you think you might use. You have to know enough about the species to be able to identify weak points in its life cycle and a thoughtful approach of attacking it at that weak point. As I'll point out in several examples, some of the ones I've given and others that I will give, it often isn't very sophisticated science. Eradication generally, so it's sort of the antithesis of the IHMC, in fact, which deals with really sophisticated, cutting-edge science. A lot of this is really pretty crude stuff, but you do have to know enough about the species to know how to attack it. And usually there is a weak point. An important fact is that it really is much, much easier to eradicate if you find a species before it's begun to spread. Even if it's spread pretty far, that doesn't mean it can't be done. And this is a very good example. This is, even though it says Asiatic as the species name, it's an African root parasite of a number of crop plants, witchweed. It got into the Carolinas and eventually covered about 400,000 acres, and it's a terrible economic problem. At that point, the USDA and the North Carolina and South Carolina governments mounted a very good eradication campaign. This was in early 1950s, and it involved embargoing the movement of soil out of infected areas, this sort of thing, and use of chemicals, a lot of them. And over this 50 years, they've reduced it down to, there's now about maybe 1,500 acres that are still infested in 3 counties in North Carolina. And all the rest, it's all gone. And eventually they'll succeed. And there'll probably be some big ceremony when they get the last witchweed. But it's cost them about $250 million so far, over 50 years. And agriculture often does have that kind of money, but conservation concerns don't. And so it helps to get on the case early and start work early. So this then suggests that we should have a very good early warning rapid response system. And I could give another, we don't, but we should. And I could give another talk about how we could do that. It is technically feasible, but we're not really doing it very well, although it's getting better. There are a number of cases in the US that are really tragic, where species that are now raging pests could have been eradicated, but weren't. This is one from out west that's sort of sad. This is Crupina, sometimes called bearded creeper. It was discovered in northern Idaho in 1968. And at that time, it infested about 40 acres. And not very heavily, and it easily could have been eliminated almost certainly with herbicide and some pulling. But no one did it. And they looked at it. It was observed. It was recorded by extension scientists. And in 1970, it was still at around 40 acres. And by 1981, it was up to about 24,000 acres. It was spreading. And at that time, it was declared a federal noxious weed, which meant you couldn't move it around deliberately. And it was only then that they initiated a study to eradicate it, after it spread to well over 20,000 acres. So then there was an eradication study. It took them 8 years to do that. And at the end of it, they reported, yep, they could eradicate it. By then, it had spread much, much further. By the way, they said they could still do it. But the federal government didn't act on the report until 1991, 3 years later. By then, it was about 60,000 acres, and it was in 4 states. And so at that time, the federal government looked at it and said, well, now we can't do it because the herbicide we'd use would probably poison or might poison salmon. And so they abandoned the whole project. And it's a raging pest, and it could have been controlled by eradicating at the outset for years. And no one did it. Another example of this sort is a plant called Coster's Curse. If anyone here has been in Hawaii, you've definitely seen this plant. It's very characteristic leaves. It was discovered in Oahu in 1941 in a field no bigger than this building. And it sort of sat there. It was recorded by botanists. And people talked about, well, maybe it'll become a pest, but they didn't do anything about it. Could have been hand-pulled at that point. And then by the late 1940s, it had spread, still only on Oahu, to an area about 4 times that size. And at that time, the Hawaii Department of Agriculture said, well, it's not clear it's going to become a big problem, but if it does, we can take care of it, because this plant had become a problem. It's from South America, by the way. It had become a problem in Fiji. And in Fiji, it was controlled very well by introducing an insect, a thrips, that ate it. So biological control is what this is called. And it worked very well in Fiji. And they said, well, if it becomes a problem here, we'll introduce it, the insect, and that'll be the end of it. And finally, in 1955, they introduced the insect, and they immediately declared victory. As you can see, they said, we've got it, we introduced it, but it didn't work. It didn't work at all, like in Fiji, and now it's considered the second worst weed in the Hawaiian Islands. That's on all the major islands. And anyone who's been there has seen this. And it could have been controlled for years just by with almost no money, just by marshaling the effort to do it. There's a very interesting international contrast that, to me, points up the importance of acting quickly and decisively. This black striped mussel is from the Caribbean, and it was found in 1999 in Cullen Bay, which is a part of Darwin Harbour in northern Australia. And it's a relative of the zebra mussel. It's a very similar animal. And it was almost surely discovered within about 6 months of its introduction. And it was discovered in an area probably about the size of this room in a few clumps. Within 9 days of its discovery, the Australian government had quarantined the entire Cullen Bay, and they had dumped 160,000 liters of bleach into the bay and many, many tons of copper sulfate. And it kills every living thing in the bay, including every one of these black striped mussels. And the native species all have planktonic larvae, and they're recolonizing. It's not quite back to normal, but there are lots of things back in Cullen Bay. And that was the end of it. They could have had a zebra mussel case, and they didn't. And the contrast is a sad case that some people here know about. This horrible, brilliant green stuff in the front is Caulerpa taxifolia, affectionately known as the killer alga in France. It's from the Pacific, and this is all one clone in the Mediterranean. And this clone came from an aquarium, and it got to the aquarium from somewhere off the coast of Australia. That much is now demonstrated by molecular methods. Anyway, it was being kept as an aquarium plant in a number of places, public aquaria in Europe. And one of them was the famous Oceanographic Museum aquarium at Monaco. And in purging, cleaning their tanks, instead of properly disposing of this alga, which would require them to walk down 4 flights of stairs, they didn't. They threw it out the window into the Mediterranean. But the interesting thing is this all happened in probably 1984. It was discovered in 1984 in an area not bigger than this lectern by a biologist who does a lot of diving there. He reported it because he knew that it wasn't supposed to be there. And the museum denied any responsibility, claimed it came in on a boat from the Suez Canal, even though it was only found right in front of the museum. And for the next 4 years, it was not bigger than 2 or 3 of these. And this biologist tried to get them someone to act, and the French government wouldn't do it. And finally, in 1988, it began to spread, and it ended up, by 1990, it was in one other area about 80 miles away, and the French government said, well, we probably ought to do something about it. But then they squabbled among the different agencies in the French government about who's responsible for it and who would pay for it. And they never really quite resolved that. And by 1995 or 96, one agency said, okay, we'll be in charge, but now we have to figure out how to get rid of it. And by then it had spread, so it was off the coast of Spain, France, and Monaco. And now, of course, it blankets about 30,000 acres of the coast off Spain, France, Monaco, Italy, Croatia, and it's down to Tunisia. And very few things live in it. All the animals that live in the seagrass, most of the animals that live in the seagrasses here, just they can't eat it and they don't like it. And so it's been a disaster. And the sad thing is that, remember what I said, for 4 years it was the size of 1 or 2 or 3 of these lecterns, and divers, being very careful, could have collected it in net bags and removed every bit of it, but they didn't. So this is how they keep a national park, an underwater national park, clear of it now. So you know that the technology is not impossible, but they didn't do it. Okay, eradication. Okay, failing to do eradication, then the other possibilities, once a species is established, there are a number of technologies for managing it at sufficiently low levels that it's not viewed as a problem. And there are many successful long-term projects, but they don't get much press, often because they're not very exciting scientifically. Here's a good example. I'm sure you all know musk thistle. which we have around here and they have all over the United States. And this is a truck parked in one of the Kentucky state parks. And this is all musk thistle that's been pulled by DUI offenders. Okay? And the woman who's in charge of this project in Kentucky State Parks, she began this project now about 12 years ago, Joyce Bender, there was a lot of skepticism because the way they normally try to deal with it, not very successfully, is this introduced Eurasian weevil, Rhinocellus conicus, which eats it, but it doesn't eat it enough. And she didn't want to introduce another species. This species, as I'll point out later, also eats some native thistles, including one federally endangered species. But when she began this, she didn't know that. She knew that it was a potential problem. And it took about 4 or 5 years to begin to see a big decline from having these DUI offenders pull musk thistle because they were basically exhausting the soil seed bank. And then by the 6th year, it was working very well, and now you just don't see much of it. And it's a beautiful ongoing project. There's no dearth of DUI offenders in Kentucky or Pensacola for that matter. So it's an excellent project. This is a project in California. This area was at one time a nature conservancy reserve known as the Lanfair Christensen Dunes. And this awful stuff here that just completely blankets it is something called European beach grass, Ammophila arenaria. And this is a picture taken in 1992. And a woman who was the chief scientist, Andrea Picard, of that refuge, evolved a plan to get rid of it. It was covering thousands of acres of dunes. And it was crowding out a bunch of native species, including at least one federally endangered species. And because by the time she finished this project, it was actually a U.S. National Wildlife Refuge. And because both the Conservancy and the U.S. National Wildlife Refuge System wouldn't let her use herbicide, it all had to be done manually. And so she used, again, volunteer, quote, convict labor. A number of volunteers from the Nature Conservancy and a public works program called the California Conservation Corps. And they got rid of virtually all of it. It's not, it's still there. And if you look, you can find some beach grass, but it's not only not dominant, it's a minor component of the dunes. And these are all native plants, and it turned out not to be fabulously expensive. The other big invasive plant on these dunes is an ice plant, Carpa brodus, also from the Old World. And Andrea Picard also attacked this. This was harder. It often involved rolling up the mat with the roots of this plant. But once again, they were able to clear it all off, and it's now been revegetated by native plants, and the maintenance is pretty trivial. It's not a huge problem. Something closer to home, you all know this plant, kudzu. And kudzu has been controlled in a number of places. This is one. This is a what should I call it? A counterculture community. The farm, maybe some of you know about in Summertown, Tennessee. This is basically ex-hippies, and the whole area was very, very badly infested, and by just manual labor and cooperation, they were able to remove all of it, and it's not there anymore. So they had free labor. They because they're ex-hippies, they didn't use herbicides, and it worked. Even closer to home, but something you don't see much of now. You all know water hyacinth, obviously, and it used to be an enormous problem here in Florida. At one time, it covered about 140,000 acres. And now, every year, it's about 2,000 or so. And the state government tried many different approaches. They tried a variety of these garish mechanical harvesters. They couldn't remove enough of it this way. They also tried biological control with 2 introduced weevils that do eat water hyacinth, but they don't eat enough of it, so they're not really a factor in controlling this plant. And the main thing that works is 2,4-D, the herbicide. Well, of course, 2,4-D isn't something you want to dump a lot of into water, but the point is, this is just for the Swanee River. The point is that as the pest comes under control and there are more and more, there's less and less of it, this is the amount of it, you end up using less and less and less of the herbicide. So now the amount of 2,4-D that's used every year is really very minimal. But they still do have to use it. But there were a number of the rivers in Florida, the Swanee, I even remember as being just completely choked. And it was a conservation disaster because a number of other species then disappeared, especially when the rotting water hyacinth would end up removing oxygen from the water. It was awful. Aside from health aspects of a chemical like 2,4-D, there are other 2 frequent disadvantages of chemicals. One of them is they're expensive relative, say, to biological control. If biological control had worked, you wouldn't have to spend any more money once the insects were established, whereas chemicals you have to buy. And the other big problem is that species evolve resistance to any chemical. And that has happened to an extent with water hyacinth and 2,4-D even, but it's a bigger problem for some other plants. Another Florida plant, I guess maybe the 2nd or 3rd worst plant in Florida, is Australian paperbark, Melaleuca, which it still is, an incredible scourge in South Florida. At its peak, it completely infested about 400,000 acres, okay? But this is a developing success story. These are the counties that it infested, and it was very densely infested, many of them. Really, 400,000 acres of Florida was just completely covered with this stuff. And this is pretty much where it is now, and it's been reduced now to around 225,000 acres by a variety of means, primarily cutting it down and using herbicide, also some aerial spraying. They've introduced 2 insects from Australia that eat Melaleuca. This is one of them, and both have survived, and it's hoped that at least this one will begin to exert some control, especially in areas that the state doesn't, most of the control is now on state lands. And if this works, it will be all over, including on private lands. But as I said, there's already very good success with a combination of methods, especially cutting it and then spraying it, often with Garlon or Arsenal. And they've worked out the concentrations that are effective, and it's worked very, very well. There's a lot more research being done on other methods of dealing with this. This is some work done on the Big Cypress by Ron Myers of the Nature Conservancy that involves cutting and then using an herbicide on the stumps, and then about a year later burning to get rid of anything that's resprouted, any new sprouts. And it seems to have worked really well. They've pretty much gotten rid of all of it in one large area of Big Cypress. It's possible that some approach like this will work with Chinese tallow. And you should remember with respect to Chinese tallows that Melaleuca has been in South Florida for about a century, no, a little less than a century. And it's only in the last 10 years or so there's been real progress at dealing with it. But tallow is a very difficult plant. It has some of the same properties that Melaleuca does. It survives some kinds of fires very well. If you chop it, I'm sure you've seen, it sucker sprouts often. It seeds profusely. It's toxic, so you can't just send cattle or even sheep in to graze on it. But there has been some work, primarily in Texas, on cutting it, stump spraying, and also fires in the cold season, not in the growing season. And I suspect that within 10 or so years, there'll be some pretty good technologies for doing this. They'll probably be labor intensive, but I'll get to that in a moment. A really lovely maintenance control project that, again, isn't very high tech, but it's worked really well, concerns the Norway rat, which marched across Canada at the same time marched across the US. And then it sort of got to the Alberta border and it stopped. And the Albertans, any of you who've been there, know they like to say that there are no rats in Alberta, that it's a rat-free province. And there are some rats, but there are very, very few rats in Alberta. And the reason is they took it seriously. It's the famous Alberta Rat Patrol, which is funded by the province. And Alberta has laws so that homeowners and property owners are responsible for dealing with rats, and they get advice from the Rat Patrol, and if they don't do it, the Rat Patrol goes out, does it, and bills them. And it's not rat-free, but it really works. And here's the number of rat infestations in Alberta, and it's down to 10 or 20 or 30 every year in a province that's bigger than Texas. It's so unusual to find a rat that a single rat in Calgary or Edmonton is a front page story in the newspaper. So, see a rat, think about it. So they, in addition to hunting, they use anticoagulant baits as the main thing. There's a lot of interest, of course, in biological control, and sometimes biological controls work very well. Here's a case in Florida where if it hadn't worked, you'd be seeing this probably here in Pensacola. This is alligator weed, a South American plant. Some of you are nodding because you know it from other places. It's like Georgia and the Carolinas. And this picture was taken in Florida. At one time, it was thought this was going to be worse than water hyacinth. And in Florida, it's been almost completely controlled by the alligator weed flea beetle, which eats only alligator weed, and it can survive about as far north as extreme south Georgia. And so you'd have a hard time finding it in most parts of Florida. So sometimes it's worked very well. But there are two major problems with it that mean it will never be the whole solution. If you talk to a number of Australian scientists, New Zealand scientists, they'll say, well, you're just too primitive, and if you knew more about biocontrol, you could solve any of these problems. But really, there are two big problems. First of all, it usually doesn't work. You hear about the successes because they're successes, but actually only around 1/10 of well-funded biocontrol programs worldwide have achieved what would be called economic success. They've had a real impact on the target pest. About 3/10 of them actually survive, but only about 1 out of 3 of every one of those actually does the job that's supposed to do. And this leads to the second problem, and that is whether or not it's doing the job. If it survives, a number of them have had non-target impacts, just like chemicals may have non-target impacts. And I've already given an example of this. This is that Rhinocellus conicus Eurasian weevil that people like to use on musk thistle. Here it's sitting on a candidate endangered species, the Platte thistle in Nebraska, eating it. And here is a federally endangered species. This is a different beetle. This is not the Rhinocellus. This is Cirsium hydrophyllum, which is a California thistle that's on the federal endangered species list. And the listing notice in the Federal Register says it all. It's endangered because it's been eaten down to almost nothing by Rhinocellus conicus, introduced for control of pest thistles. So there are a number of examples of non-target impacts. Actually, an increasing number of cases are known where they're non-target impacts. I think the important take-home message is, I think it's exemplified very well by the case I talked about in Hawaii with Koster's curse. Remember, they didn't do very simple mechanical and chemical control that would have solved the problem because their entomologist told them, we can solve the problem later by introducing this thrips that eats the plant. And it didn't work. And I could give other cases like that. So the important thing about biocontrol is not that it should never be done, but it shouldn't be viewed as an excuse not to try other less elegant solutions right away before. Melaleuca is a very good example. To this day, we don't know if those introduced species are going to work much or not, but there's already been big successes in cutting back on it. I'll close with 3 or 4 thoughts. First, I have to say something about the hurricane. How can you not come to Pensacola and not talk about the hurricane? There's actually a fair amount of research on the general impacts of hurricanes on biological invasions, particularly Hurricane Andrew in the Miami area. There's been some very good studies of what happened there, and some for Hurricane Hugo that ripped into South Carolina, especially. And I have to tell you, I'm sorry to say that the news is bad. In general, although there may be a temporary apparent benefit. For example, Hurricane Andrew leveled thousands of acres of what's considered Florida's worst plant, which is Brazilian pepper, which covers more than 500,000 acres of the state. So it cleared it pretty much, or it killed them, and everyone said, great. But in a general way, what's happened since then and what's happened with other hurricanes is that a lot of these invasive species are invasive precisely because they're adapted to thrive in disturbed settings, to seed well, to germinate. They're often profuse seeders. And Chinese tallow is a good example of that. I've seen a few of them around town now that are down, but I suspect it'll be a worse rather than a better problem, ultimately because of the hurricane. A second general point that I want to make is that many of the successful eradications and some of the successful maintenance management approaches rested on very heavy use of person power. It was very labor intensive. And of course, that's viewed as old-fashioned. And it's also expensive, often. In some cases, there's free labor. Like in Alabama and Arizona, at least, inmates are forced to work. And often they break rocks. And I've so far found examples in 24 states in which corrections officials have allowed various programs to use convict labor to deal with introduced species, and some of them worked very well. Those California dune examples are a good case. Of course, there's some kinds of projects you couldn't use convict labor for, if they used chainsaws, or you couldn't have the Alberta Rat Patrol manned by convicts, but they could do other things. There's also the political issue of whether they're competing with free labor then, but if we're not paying otherwise to deal with this problem, and often in this country we're not, it seems to me it's foolish to have them breaking rocks when they could be removing invasive plants. We could actually pay people to do this work, and some of these examples that I gave, including the Lanfear Christensen Dunes case, the Alberta Rat Patrol, the Melaleuca project, involves paying people to do this work. The most impressive example of that isn't in this country, but it's a massive public works program called Working for Water in South Africa, which the raison d'etre of the project, which was started by the Mandela government, is to remove invasive plants. What the problem in South Africa, in large parts of South Africa, are a very dry country. And the invasive plants include things like acacia and hakea that use huge amounts of water. And so the government became very interested in it largely for water purposes. But it's employed anywhere from 20 to 40,000 desperately poor people. I've seen this in action. I visited this program. People, usually women, often with children, that had no jobs at all and lived in metal shacks. And this organized them into brigades, had child care so they could work, and it's done a very good job of removing exotic plants in a number of areas. They're continuing. It's been going for a number of years now, and it's extremely impressive results. Of course, public works programs are not very popular in this country right now, but it's a possibility. Then there's also the possibility of using volunteers, and there are all sorts of volunteer groups. Nature Conservancy is the one that's probably most aggressively engaged volunteers to get rid of invasive plants especially, but there are many others, and we could do more of that. My favorite is actually the Nature's Way Montessori School, where my daughters go, who have organized a team of people to go out, and all the students have to do public service project of one sort or another, and they've actually cleared about 7 acres around the school of a lot of introduced plants, and it gets them interested in the general problem also. It's sort of, volunteerism generally engages the public in the larger issue, so it's a good idea. I guess my penultimate point is one that I've alluded to before, and that is that most of the examples I've given, and others I could give, used didn't use too much biology. They had to know something about the species, but not a huge amount, and the techniques were often quite primitive. I could give other examples where really very sophisticated science turned out to be extremely useful, but in many of these cases, especially getting rid of species early before they become established, it's almost always the antithesis of elegant science. It's crush them immediately, and that's the end of it.